How are we doing, pirates? You ready for some global marketing action? Well, I hope so. You're watching this video, aren't you? Well, this is the last of all the modules, and it's a good thing that it's last because it's going to lead straight into our case that you just got loaded up in Blackboard for you today. So now when we're talking about global marketing, okay, we've been talking about marketing all semester so far. So marketing is a function of the 4 Ps. It's the process of planning, executing. You've seen this definition before. Now, global marketing does everything marketing does. It just has a different scale and/or scope. And we are going to spend the rest of the slides distinguishing between marketing and global marketing. So why do we need to leave our home country? Well, it could be the case that we're saturated in the local market and we still need growth. So we need access to new markets. It could be the case that we need access to new resources. Could be the sources, could be cheaper labor, it could be raw materials, it could be new technologies or new ideas or new talent or new people. Well, none of that stuff can be found here in the local market, so we need to go to a more global market. It also could be the case that this is a survival mode. That's why we're doing global. For many US-based companies, on average, 75% of their sales are outside the US. Coke, it's 90%. If you're in a country, smaller countries like Japan, and it's not like Japan is really a small country, but 85% of all their revenue is outside of Japan. If you look at Germany, Germany's not a small country. But for Germany and many of the EU countries, France has less than 75 million people. Japan has only 120 million people. The domestic economy is only so large. In order for your company to really scale, you need to leave the home country. Now, globalization, this is Thomas Friedman, famous author, New York Times. This idea of globalization is not global marketing, but the idea that across countries, across regions of the globe, that similar things, desires, whatever you want to call it, are more similar than not. We can go through the millions of reasons of why this is the case. We have a global culture. We have movies and music and politics that go pan-regional. The idea of every country being their own unique island, although every country still is unique, we now have things, we now have culture, we now have music and movies and sports and soccer and politics. We have a global media. We have globalization. What is global marketing and what isn't it? It does not mean we need to do business in all 200 plus countries. As a matter of fact, if you pick 5 or 8 that you manufacture, source, and sell in, that is global marketing. It does mean a widening of the business horizons. I think that's the best way to say it. We're scanning the world for opportunities and threats. You're doing your SWOT analysis, and you're looking for where could my product sell well? Where could we manufacture and source well? Where can we find better talent for what we do? It all comes down to competitive advantage. Where can we find competitive advantage? Where can we find growth? Before we get into some of our other more marketing things, we have to talk about this globalization standardization and globalization localization. So we can think about 2 main strategies when we're talking about taking our products abroad. Standardization, which means it's the same exact thing, and adaptation, which means there is variation of it. If we go to Coca-Cola corporate, part of your corporate tour is, this is the taste of Coca-Cola around the world. In the United States, we like it kind of sweeter. In many other parts of the world, Coca-Cola is not as sweet, right? This thing right here may look like it's the same thing all over the place, but there's software that helps it adapt to a local market. So you have to decide whether, can you standardize? I mean, look at an automobile. Can you standardize it globally? No. Some people have the steering wheel on the other side. The United States is one of the only few countries in the world that does not use the metric system. I like this idea, think globally, act locally, and some people call that glocal. Maybe I should put a little hyphen in there. Glocal. All right. When we're assessing global markets and we're doing our situation analysis, part of our situation analysis has to look at a number of areas: economic, infrastructure, government, and social culture. Okay, we're going to go into each of these in a little bit more detail. Okay, when we look at economic and we're doing a situation analysis, gross domestic product, gross national income, purchasing power parity, human development index. This is more on an education thing. Purchasing GDP and GN and gross domestic income, those are standard kind of things. You know what those are. Purchasing power parity is, if someone were to make the equivalent of $20,000 in the U.S., they would definitely be below the poverty line, and they would definitely struggle. If someone were to make $20,000, the equivalent of $20,000, in many other countries around the world, they could be considered upper middle class. It could be the case that a number that seems ridiculous to us could be middle or upper middle class in other parts of the world, because goods and services cost less, the quality of life is different, and you can get the proverbial more bang for your buck. So you don't need to have the same equivalent salaries that we have here, or Germany has, or France has. There are other parts of the world where they probably live better, even though people in the United States have a six-figure income. That's purchasing power parity, right? We have to look at market size and population growth size. One of the reasons the EU was created was to create a larger market that was protected, because other parts of the world were scaling exponentially. I mean, there's no question in the next 5 to 8 years that we're going to see China surpass in every financial metric the United States market to become the world's largest consumer market. It's almost there now. It's not there yet, but it's almost there now. And then we have population. We have population trends, demographics, socio-cultural things, but also just the raw number. The more people, the more markets exist. The larger market size are, the more attractive it would be for a marketing company to think about sending products and services to a particular area. Here we go. This is some of that purchasing power parity that I was talking about, evaluating real income and what incomes mean in one country versus another country. We have to look at infrastructure, both physical infrastructure, such as transportation and rail and airports and ports. Also technological infrastructure, fiber lines, T1 lines, banking infrastructure, logistics infrastructure. These all play into a factor of which countries we could enter quicker or easier, at which cost, which one should we do first, which one should we do second. We have to look at government. I mean, we have to look at the rule of law and how stable things are. We have to look at whether government actions involve quotas, which involve limiting the total number of things that could come into a particular country, tariffs, which put a tax on particular goods and services. Trade agreements. Some countries we have trade agreements with and some we do not. And also financial aspects of exchange. We have to examine socio-cultural factors. More than anything else, as a marketer, this is one of the things I probably spend my most time in when it comes down to thinking about global marketing. If we have a product or we have a service, it fits within our local culture because this is where it was developed. But how is that going to be perceived in another culture? So here's some things we can look at, broadly speaking. Time orientation. Here in the United States, we are very much into being on time. Time is very literal. Germany and Northern Europe, very literal. China, they tend to be also very much on time and very literal. 9 o'clock means 9 o'clock. Latin time, many Latin countries, being on time is rude. There's some flex. Time means something else. There are some cultures that are heavily masculine influenced. I can think of some of the Middle East cultures, for instance. And that plays into a factor. If you have goods that even are marketed towards women, it may be the case that men are still making the decision. Even something like washer and dryers. There should be men in the ad as well. Some countries have a strong equality mindset. So if you think of Finland and Norway and Sweden, those three countries in particular are very, very much on the equality and not having this issue with male-female. Individualistic cultures versus collectivist societies. The United States is the most individualistic culture in the United States. The idea of the American dream, the self-made person. In other parts of the world, we have a very collectivist-like society. We'll have multiple generations under the same roof. Here in the U.S., we tend to all have our own homes and our own cars. It fits more with the individualism mindset. There are a lot of countries that are comfortable with ambiguity and uncertainty. And there are many other countries that are very, very much black and white. Power distance. Is there a high hierarchical society or is it a low power society? If I think of China, if I think of Eastern collectivist societies, they tend to have a very, very high power distance. If I think of more, some individualistic cultures also have a high power distance. But if I think of, I'll go back to Norway, Sweden, Finland, they have a very, very low power distance. Flatter organizations, higher span of responsibility, smaller corporations in general overall. Okay. If you are the CMO of a particular company, you have to decide how you are going to enter a foreign market. Should we just direct and export? Okay, we can do that. We can take our product, wherever it's manufactured, put it on a boat, get some logistics going, get the proper paperwork going, pay the proper taxes, and actually get that product into another country, direct exporting. We could franchise, which a local operator acquires rights to our brand in that country. This tends to happen more with services than products. But yes, you can franchise. You can do some kind of strategic alliance. Strategic alliance is when two companies get together. Okay? There tends to not be a whole lot of legal involved. There tends to not be a whole lot of capital involved. It's more handshake. But they'll say, okay, you do this for me, I do this for you, and we'll see if we can both benefit. Joint venture is when two companies get together and create another company. It is a significant financial investment. This is lots of lawyers involved. This is a very, very long-term agreement. Joint ventures. For most everything that happens in China, it has to be some kind of a joint venture because the government mandates that China has to own more than 51%, at least 51% of any entity in the country. And finally, we have direct investment, which is when you, the CMO, put all the money in, you're all in, no local partners, it's just you starting greenfield in another country. Now you notice we have some axes here. The more you put in, the riskier it may be, but the more control you might be. Higher risk, higher return. Higher risk, higher return. Not that much risk. There's not that much margin here. There's more risk the more we go this way, but we have more control the more we go this way. Okay? All right. Finally, we're going to wrap up this chapter by doing what we do all the time, and we're going to start looking at our PPP and P. First, we have to talk about STP. It's one of my favorite topics. But when we are going to STP, we have to think about just more than two variables such as price and quantity. We have to think about those cultural nuances. We have to think about subcultures within a culture. I mean, if you think about a country like Germany, and northern Germany and southern Germany are not the same thing. There are different subcultures in northern versus southern Germany. Things like the role the product has in the consumer's life. How are you going to position? Is it adaptation or more a global play? Or is there a single positioning strategy across all these particular markets? STP is harder on a global scale. You do have to do it market by market. So when we're talking about the product P, this is our local conversation. Is it adaptation? Or is it a global product that it's the same product everywhere? If we talk about pricing is harder to do on the global scale because we could have tariffs that impact the price. We could have quotas. We could have extra logistics costs and distribution costs. We could have extra local taxes. We could have extra local competition, and we have to spend more SG&A, particular advertising, to get our brand that never existed in the history of this particular country. It's never been known. The economic conditions in certain countries, I mean, if we just look at the EU, if we look at Germany and compare that to Italy, Spain, and Greece, we have radically different economic conditions that may affect how you price, or it may affect location. And finally, there's some countries that have significant anti-dumping policies, meaning we might have so much extra inventory in one country that we're pretty much just unloading it in another country at such prices that are so ridiculous. We're basically dumping. And there's countries that don't let us do that. When we think about global distribution and logistics, this tends to be one of the areas we spend the most amount of time when we're talking about global. The global supply chain is large. It is complex. Some countries have very unique logistic things, like Japan, for instance. It's a very small, congested major cities. There's no 18-wheelers that are going to be able to drop product off to the equivalent of the CVS in downtown Tokyo. It's just not possible. They use smaller, multiple delivery per day. That's where just-in-time inventory came from. Because the factories weren't large enough to be able to handle space, and retail outlets also are not large enough to handle that much inventory. And plus, the logistics chain in Japan is radically different. Suppliers must be able to create and deliver to these outlets. In Europe, there's significantly more rail distribution. That's not the case here in the U.S. It's significantly more 18-wheeler and road distribution. And finally, we have to talk about the global marketing mix. We have literacy issues. We have symbolism issues. We have cultural and religious factors. It's something as simple as, Richard Nixon, who was probably in the news because of people down in Washington and what they've did, and that's a whole other story. But his, not catchphrase, but his universal thing was he used to put his two things like this, and like victory, 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 victory. He would, victory, that's he would do that everywhere he went. Okay, he went to Australia and did that, and that's the equivalent of giving someone the middle finger. You have to be very careful. You have to be careful about language. It wasn't all that long ago that Chevy tried to sell the Chevy Nova down in Mexico, and they didn't change the name. It was the Chevy Nova, which in Spanish means no va, which means no go. So the no-go car did not sell well in Mexico because no one wanted to buy the no-go car. Right? One last thing that I wanted to bring up, just talking about the complexities of global marketing, particularly supply chain. This little thing has somewhere in the vicinity of 160 to 170 parts. I always forget the exact number. But it has this 160 to 170 parts that come from 40 different countries that are then shipped to one country and manufactured in one country and then shipped out to like 111 countries to be sold. So where it's assembled versus manufactured, but if you think of the parts inside of it, the accelerometer is Germany, the chips, US, UK, China, the battery, South Korea or China, the camera comes from Sony and parts of it from Qualcomm. Qualcomm is in the US. They also make the modem for the phone right here, chips, networking, Qualcomm. The screen is Corning, that's New York, Upper New York. The gyroscopes is Switzerland. The flash memory is Toshiba, flash memory Samsung. The OLED screen is Samsung in South Korea. The LCD screen is Sharp or LG, Korea or Japan. You get the feel that, this idea of global marketing is not just the marketing and selling of something. When I think of global marketing, I tend to think more supply chain and from the manufacturing and the distribution side of the equation. Hope this was fun. If you have any questions, shoot me an email. I'll be sending case questions to you very, very shortly. Thanks.